Welcome. Another mystery awaits, hidden in plain sight.
The air in St. Mary Mead had turned crisp with the arrival of autumn, golden leaves swirling across the narrow lanes. Inside the drawing room of the vicarage, Miss Jane Marple listened with mild amusement as Reverend Leonard Clement read aloud from the newspaper. His wife, Griselda, was arranging a vase of chrysanthemums, her expression torn between boredom and polite interest. "A most peculiar incident in London," the Reverend murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "Henry Fortescue, the celebrated composer, was found dead in his study last night, a single gunshot to the heart. Yet the circumstances are rather unusual." Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting, glanced up. "Oh, indeed," the Reverend continued. "The door was locked from the inside, the window fastened as well. No sign of forced entry, and get this, his own music was playing when they found him, a piece he composed only last month, his final work." "How very melodramatic," Griselda muttered, snipping a wilted stem. "The authorities found something curious on his desk," the Reverend added. "A single white rose, and a piece of paper with one word, Requiem." Miss Marple paused, her needles clicking to a halt. "That is unusual." The case, it seemed, was an enigma. Henry Fortescue was no tragic young artist, but a rather pompous man in his 50s, successful and wealthy. He had been working on a symphony for the past year, the pinnacle of his career, meant to be performed at the Royal Albert Hall. His death was ruled neither suicide nor accident. Murder, then. But how? Unable to resist the call of a puzzle, Miss Marple soon found herself in London, invited by an old acquaintance, Inspector Craddock. "It's a blasted locked-room mystery," he admitted, leading her through Fortescue's grand townhouse. "Nobody came in, nobody went out. The only other people home were his valet and housekeeper, and they heard nothing until the music stopped." The study was exactly as the police had found it. The heavy mahogany door locked, the window shut tight, the grand piano open, its keys frozen mid-melody. The record player, which had been set to repeat, had finally run out, its needle resting in silence. The composer's body slumped in his chair, the blood dried into a dark stain on his waistcoat. Miss Marple surveyed the scene, her sharp blue eyes absorbing every detail. The room smelled faintly of gunpowder and something else. Something floral. She moved to the desk, noting the single white rose, its petals unfurling with unnatural perfection. "There was no vase?" she asked. "No, just the rose, placed there deliberately," Craddock said. Miss Marple frowned. A rather poetic touch for a murder. Craddock sighed. "As for the gun, there's another puzzle. It was found on the floor beside him, wiped clean of prints. No sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds." She picked up the sheet of paper that bore the single word, Requiem. His final composition, but was this meant as a title or a message? Craddock gestured toward the valet, a pale, nervous man in his 40s who stood near the door. "Mr. Graves here was the one who knocked first. When there was no response, he and the housekeeper forced the door open." Miss Marple turned to him. "You were devoted to Mr. Fortescue, I assume?" "Yes, madam. He was a demanding man, but I served him faithfully." "And you heard nothing? No shot?" "Nothing, madam. Only the music." "How odd." She walked to the window, pressing a gloved hand against the glass. It was locked securely, the latch firm, but something outside caught her attention, a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a foot to rest upon. She made a small sound of interest. Miss Marple turned back to Craddock. "And what of his latest work? The symphony he had been composing?" Craddock sighed. "Gone. Stolen. The sheet music is missing." Now that was intriguing. A murder, a vanished manuscript, and a single white rose. The pieces did not fit, not yet, but Miss Marple had a feeling they soon would. Miss Marple stood in the dim study, the silence thick around her. Though the police had scoured the room for clues, she had long believed that true understanding lay not in what was seen first, but in what was overlooked. And there was something here, something that did not sit right. She stepped closer to the desk, her eyes flicking between the items carefully arranged upon its polished surface. The white rose lay in stark contrast to the dark wood, its petals unblemished. The note beside it, Requiem, was written in Fortescue's usual hand, but there was something mechanical about the strokes, as if he had written it absent-mindedly or under duress. She glanced toward the record player, its needle resting at the end of the vinyl. A most curious choice, to have one's own music playing at the time of death. "Inspector Craddock," she said softly, "was the record placed at the beginning, or was it set to repeat?" Craddock scratched his head. "Repeat, I believe. It must have played several times before the housekeeper heard it stop." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet music is a rather imprecise measure of time. Tell me, do we know exactly when Mr. Fortescue died?" "The coroner estimates around 9 last night," Craddock said. "But we don't have an exact moment, only when the housekeeper forced the door open, around 10. Miss Marple nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "That is most interesting." She turned her attention to the valet, Mr. Graves, who stood stiffly near the doorway, his eyes downcast. "You said you were devoted to Mr. Fortescue, yet you did not hear the gunshot?" Graves shook his head. "No, madam. The music was loud." "Yes, of course." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, then drifted to the room itself. She moved to the fireplace, running a gloved hand along the mantelpiece. There was a faint smudge of dust, undisturbed. Nothing had been taken or placed there recently. But when she turned to the windowsill, she found something else, a small speck of dirt. She bent slightly, examining it closely. It was out of place in a house this well kept. Straightening, she turned toward Craddock. "Would you be so kind as to check outside, Inspector? I believe there may be something of interest along the ledge." Craddock frowned but motioned for a constable to investigate. As the officer stepped out into the darkened garden, Miss Marple caught a flicker of movement from Graves. Not much, just a tightening of the jaw, a slight shift of the shoulders. It was a very small thing, but then again, it was the small things that mattered most. The constable returned moments later, his expression puzzled. "There's a faint impression on the ledge, ma'am. Like someone stepped there, but it's barely visible." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Fascinating." Craddock folded his arms. "You're thinking someone climbed in, but the window was locked from the inside." Miss Marple smiled. "Locks can be closed after the fact, Inspector. And some doors, even when locked, are not quite as impenetrable as they seem." The valet was growing paler by the second, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Miss Marple took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, did Mr. Fortescue receive any visitors yesterday?" Graves swallowed hard. "No, madam." "No one at all?" "No." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, and yet you hesitated before answering. The valet's hands twitched. I don't know what you mean." Craddock's patience was wearing thin. "Out with it, man. Who came to see him?" Graves opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice softer still. "You see, Mr. Graves, I believe Mr. Fortescue did have a visitor he did not expect, but whom he let inside nonetheless." There was a heavy pause. Then, at last, the valet exhaled shakily. "A woman," he muttered. "A lady in a dark coat. She came in the afternoon, but he didn't let her stay long. He was angry, more than I'd ever seen him." Craddock pounced on the detail. "Who was she?" I don't know her name. But she was young, blonde. She left after only a few minutes. Looked frightened, she did." Miss Marple's mind whirred. A missing manuscript, a single white rose, a visitor whom Fortescue had dismissed in anger. The pieces were shifting, beginning to align. She turned back to the desk, to the note that read Requiem. It was not simply a title. It was a message. Not to the police, but to someone else entirely. And now, she suspected, she knew exactly whom to find next. Miss Marple sat primly in the study, her hands folded in her lap, the quiet hum of London streets filtering through the thick curtains. Inspector Craddock, standing near the hearth, flipped through his notes while the valet, Graves, remained stiff by the doorway. A woman in a dark coat, young, blonde, frightened. The description alone set Miss Marple's mind working, though she concealed her thoughts beneath an expression of mild curiosity. Craddock exhaled sharply. Well, that gives us something to go on, at least. A young woman visits, there's an argument. Then later that night, Fortescue is found dead. He turned his sharp gaze on Graves. You're sure he didn't call for her? She just arrived. Graves hesitated for the briefest of moments. Yes, sir. She knocked, I answered. She asked to see him and... A pause, so slight it might have gone unnoticed. He seemed surprised. Surprised, you say? Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the room, and Graves flinched as though he had misspoken. Yes, madam. Surprised and displeased. And yet he let her in, she murmured. Graves's fingers twitched at his side. Yes, madam. For a few minutes. Craddock nodded toward the constable at the door. Right, we'll find this woman soon enough. But let's see what the others have to say. The housekeeper's waiting in the parlor. They left the study, moving through the dimly lit corridors of Fortescue's grand townhouse. The housekeeper, Mrs. Carruthers, sat with her hands folded neatly over her apron, her posture as rigid as the heavy wooden chair she occupied. She was a woman in her late 50s, severe in manner, with a face set in permanent disapproval. At their entrance, she sniffed as if bracing herself for an unpleasant duty. Craddock wasted no time. Tell us what you heard last night, Mrs. Carruthers. She pursed her lips. Not much, sir. The master was in his study, as usual. Music playing, as usual. I heard him call for Graves once, around 7, I believe. But otherwise, I paid no mind. You didn't hear the gunshot? Not a thing, she said firmly. That music was loud, and I had my hands full in the kitchen. When it finally stopped, I knocked to ask if he wanted anything before I retired for the night. When he didn't answer, I fetched Graves. Miss Marple observed her closely. Mrs. Carruthers, did you see the young woman who visited earlier in the day? The housekeeper's mouth tightened. I saw her leave. Looked pale as a ghost, she did. Nearly ran down the steps. And did Mr. Fortescue mention her afterward? No, madam. But he was in a foul temper all evening. Craddock tapped his pen against his notepad. What about the missing manuscript? Did you ever see it? Mrs. Carruthers' face darkened slightly. Oh, we all saw it, sir. He was obsessed with that music. Kept it locked in the cabinet when he wasn't working on it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, it was stolen. Or misplaced, Mrs. Carruthers muttered. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Do you think so? The housekeeper hesitated. Well, it wouldn't be the first time things have gone missing. Craddock's brows lifted. What do you mean by that? Mrs. Carruthers shifted uncomfortably. Only that sometimes things were moved. The master would be in a rage, accusing someone of touching his work, but no one ever admitted to it. Sometimes it turned up elsewhere, sometimes not at all. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured, almost as if someone had access to that study without his knowledge. Craddock made a note. And who, besides Fortescue himself, had a key to that cabinet? Only Graves, sir. Miss Marple glanced at the inspector, who was already gesturing for the constable to bring the valet back in. Graves appeared moments later, his face drawn. "Graves," Craddock said, "we need to be clear about something. Did you ever move Mr. Fortescue's manuscript?" Graves swallowed. "No, sir. I would never. But you had access to it." "Only when he requested it, sir." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Mr. Graves, did Mr. Fortescue ever accuse you of misplacing it?" The valet hesitated too long before answering. "Once, but it turned up later." "And where did it turn up?" "In the music room, madam." Craddock's frown deepened. "And who had access to the music room?" Graves shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone, sir. Guests, students who came for lessons, sometimes musicians." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ah, so he was working with others on this symphony." Graves hesitated again. "On occasion, madam. He was very secretive about his work, but there were a few musicians who visited." "Anyone recently?" "A young man, a violinist." Craddock straightened. "Name?" "Michael Ryder, sir." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. A young woman, frightened, a missing manuscript, and now a musician who had access to Fortescue's work. The web of deception was beginning to take shape, but the truth still lay tangled within. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room of Henry Fortescue's grand townhouse, her hands folded over her handbag as the faint chime of a distant clock marked the late afternoon hour. Inspector Craddock paced beside the fireplace, frowning at his notes, while the housekeeper, Mrs. Carruthers, busied herself arranging tea things with unnecessary force. The house still carried the oppressive silence of a place recently emptied of life. Outside, the London rain began to patter against the windows, blurring the gas lights into hazy smears of gold. The name Michael Ryder hung in the air between them like an unresolved chord. A violinist, a visitor, someone who had access to Fortescue's music and perhaps his secrets. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to seize upon the nearest suspect. Motives were never so straightforward in cases like these. Craddock set his notes aside with an exasperated sigh. "So far, we've got a missing manuscript, a frightened young woman, and a valet who seems to know more than he's letting on. But none of that explains why Fortescue was killed in such a peculiar way, locked inside his own study with his music playing. What kind of killer stages a death like that?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "The sort who wishes to make a statement, perhaps. Or one who wished to buy time before the body was discovered." Craddock gave her a sharp look. "You think the time of death is wrong." "It is possible, is it not?" she said gently. "After all, we have only an estimate from the coroner and the knowledge that the music played for some time before it stopped. We have been assuming that Fortescue was alive when the gun was fired. But what if he was already dead before the shot was heard?" Craddock blinked. "You mean the killer fired after the fact? To mislead us?" "It would explain why no one heard a struggle," she mused, "and why the study was so meticulously arranged. A crime of passion rarely leaves the scene so composed." The housekeeper made a small, disapproving noise. "I don't see why anyone would go to all that trouble. If you mean to kill a man, you shoot him and be done with it." Miss Marple smiled at her over the rim of her teacup. "That is certainly the most efficient way. But we must ask, what was to be gained by this particular presentation? A single white rose, a piece of music, a locked door. It is as much a performance as a crime." Craddock rubbed a hand over his chin. "So we've got someone who wanted to send a message. But to whom?" Miss Marple placed her cup back in its saucer with a soft clink. "Perhaps it would help if we knew more about Mr. Fortescue's relationships. We have heard about the young woman who visited that afternoon, and now we have Michael Ryder. But what of Mr. Fortescue's personal life? Did he have family, a fiancé, anyone with a claim to his estate?" Mrs. Carruthers sniffed. "No fiancé. The master wasn't the sort to settle down, but he had a niece, Rachel Fortescue, his late brother's girl. She came around every so often, though I wouldn't say they were close. And there's his business partner, Mr. Lionel Wade. They ran the publishing house together. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And what of Mr. Ryder? How often did he visit? Twice, maybe 3 times, the housekeeper admitted. But the master had little patience for him. Said the boy was more ambition than talent. And yet he let him see his work. Not willingly, she muttered. But Mr. Ryder was persistent. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock, a struggling musician eager for success, a niece who was not particularly close to her uncle, and a business partner with a shared interest in the deceased's publishing house. 3 potential motives, none of them yet clear. "Tell me, Mrs. Carruthers," she said, "when the young lady left that afternoon, you said she looked pale. Did she seem upset, frightened?" The housekeeper considered this. "I'd say upset more than frightened, but troubled, certainly." Miss Marple nodded. "Then I should very much like to meet Miss Rachel Fortescue." Rachel Fortescue received them in a modest but elegant flat in Bloomsbury, where she sat curled in an armchair, a cigarette burning idly between her fingers. She was in her late 20s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of controlled composure that suggested she rarely let emotion slip. When Craddock mentioned her uncle's death, she exhaled a thin stream of smoke and said, "I can't say I'm surprised." Miss Marple observed her keenly. "You expected something to happen to him?" Rachel's lips curved, not quite into a smile. "Not expected exactly, but my uncle had a talent for making enemies." "Did that include you?" Craddock asked. Her gaze flicked to him, assessing. "I won't pretend we were close, Inspector. My uncle was a difficult man, brilliant but cruel. He never gave without expecting something in return." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "You visited him the day he died." Rachel stiffened. "How did you—" She cut herself off, then sighed. "Yes, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're asking." "No one is accusing you, my dear," Miss Marple soothed. "We only wish to understand what was said between you." Rachel hesitated, then stubbed out her cigarette. "I went to ask for something that belonged to my father. Before he died, he wrote a piece of music, a small composition. My uncle took it after the funeral, said he would look after it, but he never gave it back. I wanted it." Miss Marple's expression remained kind. "And did he agree?" Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Of course not. He said it was worthless, that my father had no talent, that he had done me a favor by keeping it out of the world." Her jaw tightened. "I was angry. I left." Craddock scribbled something in his notebook. "Was the manuscript missing when you left?" Rachel frowned. "I don't know. He never let me see it." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. A missing manuscript, a young woman desperate for a piece of her father's legacy, and a murder that was as much a spectacle as it was a crime. The web of motives was growing, but there was still one crucial piece missing. As they stepped out into the rain, Miss Marple turned to Craddock with a small, knowing smile. "Inspector, I do believe it's time we spoke to Mr. Michael Ryder. I suspect he may hold the key to this puzzle." Michael Ryder's lodgings were in a narrow street off Charing Cross, the sort of place where young musicians and struggling artists made do with small rooms and temperamental landlords. The violinist himself answered the door, a lanky man in his early 30s with restless fingers that drummed against the frame as he regarded his visitors warily. His dark hair was disheveled, his shirt hastily buttoned, as if their arrival had caught him in the midst of something unfinished. Inspector Craddock wasted no time. "Mr. Ryder, you were acquainted with Henry Fortescue." It was not a question. Ryder's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "I was. A generous term, acquainted. The old man barely tolerated me." Miss Marple, standing just behind Craddock, tilted her head. "And yet you visited him?" "More than once." Ryder exhaled sharply and stepped aside, waving them in. "No sense talking in the corridor. Come in, if you must." The small room was cluttered with sheet music. loose papers spilling from a desk covered in coffee rings and ink stains. A violin case lay open on a battered armchair. The place smelled faintly of rosin and neglect. Ryder took up a position by the window, one hand gripping the sill. "I went to see him about his work," he admitted. "Fortescue was insufferable but brilliant. I wanted to understand his process. I asked if I could study under him." Craddock snorted. By all accounts, he wasn't the mentoring type. Ryder smirked. "No, he wasn't. He turned me down, insulted my playing, and suggested I try something less dependent on skill." His fingers drummed against the sill again. "But I knew he was working on something remarkable, a new symphony, and I wanted to be part of it." Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through his frustration. "Mr. Ryder, the manuscript is missing. Do you know where it is?" His eyes flickered just for a moment. "Missing?" He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "That's rich. He probably destroyed it rather than let anyone else see it." "Did you take it?" Craddock pressed. Ryder's temper flared. "No, look, I wanted to learn from him, not steal from him. Believe me, I've no use for a piece of music I can't even begin to replicate." Miss Marple watched him closely. There was anger, yes, but also something else. Fear? Guilt? She smoothed a hand over her handbag. "You visited him the day before his death, did you not?" Ryder's jaw clenched. "Yes." "And what was his mood?" He hesitated. "He was on edge, more than usual. Kept going on about betrayal. But it was always like that with him. Everyone was an enemy." He scoffed. "Including me, I suppose." Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before straightening. "We'll need you to account for your whereabouts on the evening of his murder." Ryder stiffened. "I was here, alone, practicing." "That's convenient," Craddock muttered. Before Ryder could protest further, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. A uniformed constable entered, slightly out of breath. "Sir, there's been a development. We've found the missing manuscript." Craddock's head snapped up. "Where?" "In the possession of Lionel Wade." Michael Ryder let out a low curse. Miss Marple merely folded her hands and watched as the inspector rushed from the room, already barking orders. Lionel Wade, Fortescue's business partner, was seated in an interview room at Scotland Yard. His normally composed demeanor cracked at the edges. The manuscript lay on the table before him, its pages slightly crumpled, the ink still bold. Craddock leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Care to explain how this ended up in your possession, Mr. Wade?" Wade swallowed. "I didn't steal it, if that's what you're implying." "Then how did you get it?" Wade hesitated. "Fortescue sent it to me." Craddock arched an eyebrow. "Odd. Meh. He was reportedly obsessed with this piece. Why would he send it to you?" The man's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. "Because he wanted it secured. He said he didn't trust the people around him. He told me to keep it safe." Miss Marple, who had remained silent thus far, spoke softly. "Did he mention who he suspected?" Wade hesitated just a second too long. "No." Craddock exhaled. "It's quite damning, Mr. Wade. You, the business partner, suddenly in possession of the one thing that might hold the key to this crime? If we were looking for motive—" "I didn't kill him," Wade snapped. "Yes, I had the manuscript, but if I wanted him dead for it, why would I have kept it? Why not destroy it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "An excellent question." Craddock frowned but nodded. "Fine. You'll remain in custody for now. We'll see what else we turn up." As Wade was led away, Miss Marple turned to Craddock. "You don't truly believe he did it, do you?" Craddock rubbed his temples. "He had the manuscript. That's more than we have on anyone else." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the abandoned pages of the composition. "It's all very tidy, isn't it?" She lifted the top sheet delicately. "Too tidy." Craddock scowled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she said, her voice thoughtful, that if one wished to divert attention from the real culprit, one might plant just enough evidence to mislead. The manuscript was missing. Now it's found. The most obvious suspect has been neatly presented. And yet, Craddock frowned. Yet what? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Yet I still don't know why a single white rose was left at the scene of the crime. Craddock stared at her. A sentimental gesture, perhaps? Miss Marple shook her head. Number it was deliberate. The music, the staging, the locked door, this was never about simple greed. There's a story here, Inspector, and until we understand it, we shan't see the real villain. Craddock exhaled. So, you think we've got the wrong man? She smiled, reaching for her handbag. Oh, Inspector, I'm quite certain of it. Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair at the hotel, hands resting lightly on her lap, but her mind was whirring with activity. The white rose, the locked room, the missing and then conveniently recovered manuscript. Each piece of the puzzle was slipping into place, but the full picture remained just out of reach. What had Henry Fortescue feared? What betrayal had he spoken of in his final days, and why was Lionel Wade so eager to cooperate, yet so clearly hiding something? She pulled a small notebook from her handbag and jotted down the names of those involved. Henry Fortescue, the victim; Lionel Wade, the business partner; Michael Ryder, the struggling violinist with something to prove; Eleanor Redfern, the devoted secretary who knew more than she let on. And then there was Charlotte Bertram, the opera singer whose name had appeared on the police's list of recent visitors to Fortescue's home, though she had yet to be questioned. Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the paper. The name tugged at something in her memory, an old story, a scandal half-remembered from the society columns years ago. She rang for the hotel concierge and asked if he could procure a few back issues of the Times and the Daily Telegraph from 10 years prior, particularly anything related to the music world. Then, with the patience of someone who knew that answers always came to those who observed carefully enough, she waited. The next morning, as she sipped her tea, the concierge arrived with a stack of yellowing newspapers. She flipped through them methodically until a headline leapt out at her: "Tragedy strikes at Covent Garden. Tenor's mysterious death shocks London's elite." She read on, her keen eyes scanning every detail. A young and promising tenor, Peter Radcliffe, had died under suspicious circumstances after a performance at Covent Garden. It was ruled a tragic accident. He had fallen from the balcony of his dressing room, but some speculated it was suicide. Others whispered of foul play. The article mentioned those close to him, and there it was: Charlotte Bertram. Miss Marple folded the newspaper and placed it in her handbag. If Peter Radcliffe's death had been dismissed as an accident, why did she have the peculiar sensation that it was about to resurface in this case? At Scotland Yard, Inspector Craddock listened to her findings with a frown. "You think Radcliffe's death is connected to Fortescue's murder?" Miss Marple nodded. "I think it's possible, Inspector, that the crime we're investigating did not begin in Henry Fortescue's study, but rather in a dressing room at Covent Garden 10 years ago." Craddock exhaled. "That's a long time to hold a grudge, Miss Marple." "Some wounds never heal," she replied, "and betrayal, true betrayal, has a way of lingering in the heart." Craddock ran a hand through his hair. "We'll need to speak with Charlotte Bertram." Finding Charlotte Bertram was no great challenge. Though she had faded from the spotlight, she still moved in artistic circles and was now a vocal coach at a prestigious conservatory. She received them in her modest but tastefully furnished sitting room, a striking woman in her 50s with sharp cheekbones and a gaze that seemed to pierce through any pretense. "You've come about Henry," she said, her voice steady. "I wondered when you would." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem surprised." She gave a small, bitter smile. "I was fond of Henry, in my way, but he had a habit of digging into things best left buried." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around. the handle of her handbag. Such as the death of Peter Radcliffe. Charlotte's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in her posture, the smallest hesitation before she answered. That was a long time ago. Not long enough, Miss Marple said gently. Not if someone was willing to kill over it. Charlotte sighed, setting down the glass of sherry she had been holding. Peter was extraordinary, a voice like no other, and Henry adored him, not in the way of a mentor to a student, but something deeper. Miss Marple nodded. He loved him. Charlotte's smile was sad. Yes. And Peter was conflicted. He was engaged to Eleanor Redfern at the time. Yes, the same Eleanor who later worked for Henry. But there were whispers, letters exchanged, stolen moments, and then, one night, Peter was gone. Craddock leaned forward. You believe he was murdered? Charlotte hesitated. I don't know. But Henry never accepted the official story. He spent years digging, questioning, searching for proof that Peter had been pushed from that balcony. Miss Marple's mind raced. And do you know who Henry suspected? Charlotte's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. Lionel Wade. Craddock's expression darkened. Wade? Miss Marple turned to him. Inspector, would you be so kind as to check something in the records? I suspect Lionel Wade was at Covent Garden that night. Craddock nodded. I'll have my men look into it, but if Wade was involved in Radcliffe's death, why kill Fortescue now? Miss Marple's lips pressed together, because Henry Fortescue had finally found the proof he had been looking for. Charlotte exhaled. He told me, a few weeks ago, that he had something that would change everything. Miss Marple's heart quickened. And then he died. Craddock stood abruptly. We need to talk to Wade again. But Miss Marple shook her head, eyes sharp with realization. No, Inspector, not Wade. Craddock frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. If Wade had truly killed Henry Fortescue to silence him, then why did he keep the manuscript instead of destroying it? Charlotte stiffened. Then who? Miss Marple turned to Craddock, her voice firm. Inspector, I believe we need to pay a visit to Eleanor Redfern. Miss Marple's gloved fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her handbag as she and Inspector Craddock made their way to Eleanor Redfern's modest townhouse. The streets were quiet, the evening air crisp with the onset of autumn. Craddock, ever the practical investigator, kept his thoughts to himself, but Miss Marple could sense his doubt. He was still thinking of Lionel Wade, still considering the most straightforward path. But straightforward paths were rarely the ones that led to the truth. Eleanor Redfern received them in a small but tastefully decorated sitting room. The room was immaculately neat. Too neat, Miss Marple thought. No sign of hurried cleaning, no clutter of personal life. Just a space arranged to be seen, not lived in. Eleanor herself sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, her usual composure intact. I assume you have further questions, Inspector? She asked, her voice calm. Indeed, Miss Redfern, Craddock said, taking out his notebook. We've been looking into an old case, the death of Peter Radcliffe. There it was, the flicker of reaction. Barely more than the tightening of her fingers, a brief stiffening of her posture. But Miss Marple saw it. Eleanor exhaled softly. That was a long time ago. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Yes, my dear, but it seems Henry Fortescue had taken a great interest in it recently. Eleanor hesitated for only a second before responding. Henry was a man who could never let go of the past. A most unfortunate trait, Miss Marple agreed, especially when the past refuses to stay buried. Eleanor's lips pressed together. I don't see how this is relevant to his murder. Oh, but I think you do, Miss Marple said gently. You see, dear, I believe Henry discovered something very important, something that put him in danger. And that danger, I fear, may have come from someone very close to him. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver, but Miss Marple noticed the way she gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles just slightly whitening. A woman at ease did not sit like that. Miss Marple sighed softly. I do wonder, Miss Redfern, if you've ever been fond of music. The abrupt change of subject startled Craddock, but Eleanor's reaction was even more telling. Her lips parted slightly as if caught off guard. Music? Yes, Miss Marple continued pleasantly. Henry Fortescue's final composition was rather remarkable, wasn't it? It's fascinating how music can hold secrets. For the first time, a shadow of something like fear passed over Eleanor's face. Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly, her voice still gentle but laced with meaning. You see, my dear, I believe Henry Fortescue hid something in that composition. A message, a secret he had uncovered about Peter Radcliffe's death, and I believe that is why he was killed. Eleanor remained perfectly still. Too still. A woman accustomed to control, yet now struggling to maintain it. Miss Marple observed her carefully, waiting for the final thread to snap. I wonder, Miss Marple mused, what might happen if the authorities were to study the music more closely, if they were to unravel whatever Henry was trying to reveal. A silence stretched between them, and then there it was, the crack in the mask, a flicker of panic, quickly concealed but unmistakable. Miss Marple had seen it before in many guilty faces. Eleanor Redfern knew something, and she was terrified it would come to light. Craddock cleared his throat. Miss Redfern, do you have anything to say? Eleanor hesitated, but the damage was done. The careful veneer of composure had been punctured. The weight of secrets, so long kept, now hung heavily between them. Miss Marple, ever patient, simply waited, because she knew in the end the truth always found a way to surface. Inspector Craddock stiffened, sensing the shift in the room. Eleanor Redfern had mastered the art of control, but Miss Marple had seen the faint crack in her composure, the small, telling sign of fear. It was in the way Eleanor's fingers had momentarily tightened, in the flicker of alarm behind her eyes. A woman who had kept secrets for too long, suddenly aware that her carefully constructed world was beginning to tremble. Miss Marple sat back, adjusting the lace trim of her gloves. Music is a curious thing, isn't it, Miss Redfern? So much can be hidden within its notes. A pattern, a message, a truth waiting to be heard. Eleanor's hands remained still in her lap, but her breath had quickened, ever so slightly. Craddock leaned forward. We'd like to take another look at Fortescue's final composition, the one we recovered from Lionel Wade's office. A pause. A moment's hesitation, then Eleanor nodded. Of course, if it helps your investigation. Miss Marple's eyes remained on her. The words were calm, composed, but something in the way Eleanor agreed too readily put Miss Marple on edge. Craddock stood, snapping his notebook shut. We'll send for the manuscript immediately. But as they left Eleanor Redfern's home, a chill of unease settled over Miss Marple. A feeling, vague but insistent, that time was slipping through their fingers. By the time they reached Scotland Yard, that feeling had become a certainty. The manuscript was gone. Constable Davies, pale and shaken, relayed the news. It was here this morning, sir. Locked in the evidence cabinet. But when I checked just now, he swallowed hard. It's missing. Craddock's expression darkened. You're telling me that the most critical piece of evidence in an active murder investigation simply vanished, Davies stammered. I don't know how, sir. The cabinet wasn't forced. There's no sign of a break-in. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Not stolen with brute force, then? Stolen by someone who had access. Craddock muttered a curse under his breath. Who had the key? Davies hesitated. Only the chief clerk, sir, and myself. And he swallowed. Inspector Lewis. Craddock went rigid. Lewis? Miss Marple opened her eyes, sharp with understanding. Inspector Lewis is overseeing the financial fraud case against Lionel Wade, is he not? Craddock turned to her, realization dawning. You think he's involved? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she thought of Henry Fortescue's unfinished work, of the way Wade had clung to the manuscript like a lifeline before reluctantly surrendering it. And she thought of Eleanor Redfern's barely concealed panic at the mention of its secrets. I think, she said carefully, that Lionel Wade is not the only one who feared what that composition might reveal. Craddock exhaled sharply. Someone is trying to erase the evidence before we can decipher it. Miss Marple nodded. And I believe, Inspector, that they are quite desperate. Craddock turned to Davies. I want every officer questioned. I want that manuscript found. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew it was already too late. Whoever had stolen the composition had no intention of letting it resurface. The real question was, why, and what had Henry Fortescue discovered that was worth killing for? Inspector Craddock's frustration was evident in the tight set of his jaw, the restless energy in his pacing. The missing manuscript had shattered the fragile progress of the case, and worse, it had made one thing chillingly clear. Whoever had killed Henry Fortescue was still watching, still maneuvering, still silencing. Miss Marple sat calmly in the inspector's office, her lace-gloved hands folded in her lap, but her mind worked swiftly through the tangled threads of deception. Whoever took the manuscript, Craddock said, had access to the evidence room. That means either an officer or someone with high-level clearance. Miss Marple nodded. And we mustn't forget, Inspector, that this person is also quite desperate. Destroying evidence is no small risk. It suggests they were afraid of what might be found. Craddock muttered something under his breath and checked his watch. I've put out an internal inquiry. If Lewis had anything to do with this. But before he could finish, a sharp knock at the door interrupted him. A young constable entered, his face pale. Sir, there's been an incident. Craddock stiffened. What kind of incident? The constable hesitated. It's Lionel Wade, sir. He's dead. A silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. Craddock shot to his feet. Where? At his home, sir. He was found an hour ago. Shot. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, a pang of sorrow threading through her usual composure. Lionel Wade had been a man backed into a corner, clinging to secrets he could not afford to keep. And now, just as the case had reached a critical juncture, he had been silenced. The inspector wasted no time. Within minutes, they were in a police car, the streets of London flashing past them in a blur of grey and gold under the dim glow of street lamps. Wade's home was a grand but weary-looking townhouse, its curtains drawn, its halls too still. The moment they stepped inside, the scent of gunpowder lingered faintly in the air. The body was slumped over his desk, a single gunshot wound to the temple. A revolver lay by his limp fingers, as if placed deliberately. A scene meant to be understood at a glance. Suicide. But Miss Marple had long since learned that the simplest answer was rarely the true one. She stepped closer, her sharp eyes sweeping the room. Lionel Wade's desk was cluttered with papers, bank statements, scribbled notes, an empty glass. But it was the overturned chair that drew her attention. The way it had fallen at an unnatural angle, as if Wade had struggled before collapsing. Craddock swore under his breath. It's staged. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, Inspector, and rather hastily, wouldn't you say? A man preparing to take his own life does not typically knock his chair aside. Craddock exhaled sharply. And the missing manuscript? Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the desk. Gone, of course. The inspector motioned for the constable to take photographs, then turned back to Miss Marple. This isn't just about Henry Fortescue anymore. Someone is tying up loose ends. Miss Marple sighed. Yes, dear. And unfortunately, Lionel Wade was one of them. As they moved through the house, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the small details, a half-burned piece of paper in the fireplace, a smudge of ink on Wade's fingers. He had been writing something before he died. A last attempt, perhaps, to set things right. Craddock turned to one of the officers. Check his pockets. See if anything was left behind. Miss Marple, however, was drawn to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. A single framed photograph stood there, its edges slightly worn from handling. It was a group picture. Wade, Eleanor Redfern, and another man she did not recognize. She traced a finger lightly over the glass. Who is this? Craddock glanced over her shoulder. Peter Radcliffe. Miss Marple's lips pursed. How interesting. Craddock frowned. You think this is connected to Radcliffe's death? Miss Marple turned, her blue eyes bright with certainty. My dear Inspector, I think it's more than connected. I think Peter Radcliffe's death is the very key to this entire mystery. A shadow passed over Craddock's face. Then we're not just investigating a murder anymore. We're racing against whoever is trying to bury the truth. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and I fear, Inspector, that if we do not act swiftly, the next loose end to be tied up may very well be us. Miss Marple's gloved fingers lingered on the photograph for a moment longer before she gently set it back in place. The edges were worn, handled often, as if it had been of great significance to Lionel Wade. A sentimental attachment, or something more. Her keen gaze drifted once more over the room, the desk in disarray, the chair askew, the fireplace with its smudges of ash. There was something here, something just beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. Craddock muttered something under his breath as he rifled through Wade's desk. Nothing. Whoever did this was thorough. No notes, no scraps of the missing manuscript. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. No, Inspector, that's not quite true. Craddock straightened, frowning. What do you mean? She gestured delicately toward the fireplace. Someone attempted to destroy a piece of paper, but they did so hastily. Look there, partially burned, but not fully. Craddock stepped forward, carefully extracting the half-singed scrap with a pair of tweezers. He laid it flat on the desk. The ink had bled into the paper in places, but a few letters remained intact. Radcliffe. Craddock swore under his breath. Radcliffe. So Wade was trying to tell us something before he was killed. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and I suspect it had something to do with Eleanor Redfern. The inspector exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. First Fortescue, now Wade, and somehow Peter Radcliffe, dead over a year, links them together. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the wooden armrest of her chair. A pattern was forming, but it was still incomplete, a puzzle missing its final pieces. She thought of Henry Fortescue's music, his unfinished composition, the urgency with which he had clung to it before his death. Then Lionel Wade, who had feared its revelation enough to try and hide it. And now, Peter Radcliffe, long dead, yet still haunting the case. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the photograph once more. Tell me, Inspector, what do we know about Peter Radcliffe's death? Craddock frowned. Drowned. Supposedly an accident. Fell from his boat on the Thames after a night of drinking. No signs of foul play, though I always thought something about it felt off. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And who confirmed it was an accident? Craddock hesitated. Doctor. Whitaker signed the report. The coroner ruled it as misadventure. No obvious wounds, no struggle. Just an unfortunate fall. Miss Marple's lips pursed. And yet, Inspector, we now have 3 men connected to that photograph, and 2 of them are dead by unnatural means. I suspect the third death was not as accidental as it appeared. Craddock cursed under his breath. You think Radcliffe was murdered? Miss Marple gave him a patient smile. I rather think that's the only conclusion left to us, don't you? Craddock's expression darkened. Then we've been looking at this case all wrong. Fortescue's murder wasn't just about his composition, it was about what he had realized. And Wade was silenced before he could reveal the truth. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Quite so. And now we must ask, what did Fortescue discover about Peter Radcliffe that was worth killing for? Craddock exhaled sharply. I'll reopen the Radcliffe case. See if there was anything overlooked. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the photograph, tracing the familiar curve of Eleanor Redfern's smile. Yes, dear. And I think it is high time I had another word with Miss Redfern. I do believe she knows far more than she has let on. Craddock didn't argue. They had been circling around Eleanor from the start, her carefully poised demeanor always just a bit too controlled. If there was a missing piece to this puzzle, it was likely in her hands. As the evening deepened and the streets of London took on their usual nocturnal hush, Miss Marple found herself in the warmth of Eleanor Redfern's drawing room once more. The woman was as composed as ever, but Miss Marple did not miss the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening of her jaw. Miss Redfern poured tea with delicate precision. I must say, Miss Marple, I didn't expect another visit so soon. Miss Marple accepted her cup graciously. A dreadful business, dear. Mr. Wade's death, I mean. Eleanor's fingers barely faltered as she set the teapot down. Yes, tragic. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And yet, I find myself wondering about Mr. Peter Radcliffe. You knew him well, did you not? There it was, the faintest flicker in Eleanor's expression. We were acquainted, yes. Miss Marple set her cup down gently. Tell me, Miss Redfern, was Mr. Radcliffe's death truly an accident? Eleanor Redfern's breath caught for just a fraction of a second. A hesitation, a silent admission. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but firm. Henry Fortescue knew something, didn't he? Something about Peter Radcliffe's death, and that knowledge cost him his life. Eleanor's hands tightened around the edge of the tea tray. For the first time, the carefully constructed facade cracked. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. You see, dear, a pattern has begun to emerge. 3 men, all bound together by something from the past. Fortescue uncovered it. Wade tried to suppress it, and now both of them are dead. That leaves only one question. Her voice softened, laced with quiet certainty. What part did you play in it? Eleanor Redfern's porcelain composure shattered. Her lips parted, but no words came. Just the silent, unmistakable realization that the truth was no longer hers to hide. Eleanor Redfern's breath was shallow, her hands gripping the porcelain teacup so tightly that Miss Marple half expected it to shatter. The poised woman, always so carefully in control, had finally been caught at the edge of an unraveling truth. And Miss Marple, with all the gentleness of an old friend, waited patiently. The silence stretched. The room felt heavier for it, the ticking of the mantel clock impossibly loud in the still air. Then Eleanor exhaled shakily, setting the cup down with deliberate care. You don't understand, she murmured, her voice stripped of its usual elegance. You can't understand. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Then perhaps you should help me, dear. Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the fire, the flickering light casting shadows over her face. Peter Radcliffe didn't drown, she whispered. Not by accident. Craddock, who had been leaning against the door frame, straightened. Then he was murdered. Eleanor's lips pressed together. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, though sympathy softened its edges. And you know who did it, don't you? Eleanor flinched, but she didn't deny it. She sat rigid, her fingers curling into the fine fabric of her skirt. It wasn't meant to be like this, she said finally. No one was supposed to die. Not Peter, not Henry, not Lionel. Craddock scoffed. That's a rather high body count for something that wasn't meant to happen, Miss Redfern. Eleanor's eyes darkened, but there was no defiance left in them. Only something weary, something burdened by a secret long kept. Miss Marple spoke gently. Why don't you start at the beginning, dear? With Peter. A sharp breath. Then Eleanor closed her eyes, as though she were bracing herself for the past to come rushing in. Peter Radcliffe was a liar, she said bitterly. A charming, reckless liar. He told people whatever they wanted to hear, made them believe in things that weren't real, and her voice caught, I was foolish enough to love him. Miss Marple's head inclined slightly, but she did not interrupt. Eleanor's hands twisted together in her lap. I wasn't the only one. He was engaged to another woman, Marianne Hale. She was young, innocent, from a good family. She adored him, had no idea what he truly was. But Henry knew. Her expression twisted. Henry was his closest friend, or so he thought. But Peter used people. He used Henry, just as he used me. Craddock frowned. What exactly did Peter do? Eleanor let out a brittle laugh. He was a fraud. He gambled, borrowed money he couldn't repay. He seduced women under false pretenses and left them ruined. Marianne's father had invested in one of his schemes. Something to do with shipping, I think. But it was all a lie. When the investment collapsed, her family was ruined. And Peter... Her voice turned sharp. Peter abandoned her. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Did she take her own life? Eleanor's throat worked, but she nodded. Drowned herself in the Thames. Her body was found a week later. Craddock muttered a curse under his breath. And that was the turning point, wasn't it? Eleanor's shoulders were rigid. Henry changed after that. He saw Peter for what he was, and so he confronted him, on his boat, the night Peter fell into the river. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Henry killed him. Eleanor swallowed hard. I don't know what happened exactly. I only know that Henry came to me that night, shaking, his hands wet, his clothes disheveled. He didn't say the words, but I knew. Craddock's expression was unreadable. And Wade? Where did he fit into this? Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Lionel found out. Not immediately, but later. He was always observant, always listening. I think Henry confessed to him in some roundabout way, or maybe Lionel just put it together himself. But instead of turning Henry in, he wrote it into the music. Miss Marple's brows lifted. The unfinished composition. Eleanor nodded. Henry was tormented by what he had done, and music was the only way he could make sense of it. He put his guilt into the notes, into the structure. He thought no one would ever understand it. But Lionel did. Craddock let out a low breath. So Wade knew the truth, and someone killed him to keep it buried. Eleanor's fingers trembled. Yes. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Who, Eleanor? A pause. The fire crackled. And then Eleanor whispered, His wife. Craddock blinked. Wade's wife. Eleanor's eyes shone with something close to grief. Margaret Wade adored Lionel. Worshipped him, really, but he was never entirely hers, you see. He belonged to the music first. And then, suddenly, he belonged to a terrible secret. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She must have overheard something. A conversation, a piece of the composition, something that made her realize Lionel was protecting a murderer. Eleanor let out a breath. I think she believed she was protecting him, that if Lionel kept Henry's secret, then she had to protect Lionel. Craddock's mouth set in a grim line. So she killed him. Eleanor's voice broke. She must have. Miss Marple exhaled softly. And Henry? Did he ever suspect? Eleanor's throat tightened. Henry knew, but he let it happen. He blamed himself for Peter, for everything. He thought Wade's death was his penance. Craddock's jaw clenched. And that's why he didn't fight back when he was poisoned. Eleanor wiped at her eyes. Yes. Silence settled over the room, thick with the weight of it all. The truth, long buried, had at last come into the light. Miss Marple reached forward and patted Eleanor's hand gently. "Thank you, dear. That was very brave." Craddock exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "So now we have our answer. Margaret Wade killed Lionel to protect him, and Henry, in his own way, let himself be punished." Miss Marple nodded. "But there's still one thing left to do." Craddock gave her a look. "Confront Margaret." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Yes, dear, it's time to put an end to this." Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of Margaret Wade's sitting room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression one of mild interest. The space was immaculate, not a single item out of place, the room of a woman who needed control over her world. A fire crackled in the grate, but the warmth did little to ease the tension in the air. Chief Inspector Craddock stood by the doorway, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Margaret sat stiffly in the high-backed chair opposite Miss Marple, her fingers pressed together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "I must say," Miss Marple began, her voice pleasant, "you do keep a lovely home, Mrs. Wade." Margaret flinched as though struck. "Thank you," she said, but the words were hollow, her voice strained. Miss Marple sighed lightly. "It's a terrible thing, losing someone you love." Margaret's fingers twitched. "I wouldn't expect you to understand." "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple said kindly. "Loss can be unbearable, can't it? And when you see the person you love suffering, you want to do anything to protect them." Margaret's breath hitched just for a second. A small, almost imperceptible reaction. Miss Marple continued. "Lionel was a brilliant man, devoted to his music, devoted to you, but he was troubled, wasn't he?" Margaret's lips thinned. "He was under a great deal of stress." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, because he had discovered the truth. Henry Redfern had killed Peter Radcliffe, and Lionel, dear, gentle Lionel, couldn't bring himself to betray his friend." Margaret's throat worked. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "That you overheard, that you knew what Lionel was hiding, and you were afraid of what keeping that secret would do to him." Margaret inhaled sharply. "That's nonsense." Miss Marple sighed. "You loved him too much to let him destroy himself over a guilt that wasn't his to bear. You thought you were protecting him, didn't you?" Margaret shot to her feet. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Miss Marple remained seated, calm, unshaken. "You poisoned him, Margaret." The room seemed to shrink around them, the fire's glow casting long, flickering shadows across Margaret's face. "That's absurd," Margaret whispered. Craddock took a step forward. "We found the bottle, Mrs. Wade, in the garden shed, tucked behind the gardening tools. Traces of the same poison that killed your husband." Margaret's breathing was uneven now. "That doesn't prove anything." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but your husband's final composition does. He hid the truth in the music, and you knew that if anyone truly listened, truly understood, they would hear his confession." Margaret's eyes were wild now, her perfect composure cracking. "He was going to destroy himself. He would have turned Henry in. He would have ruined everything. He would have ruined himself." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "So you silenced him." Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. "He left me no choice." There it was. The admission. The weight of it settled over the room like a stone sinking in water. Craddock stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Margaret Wade, I'm arresting you for the murder of Lionel Wade. You need not say anything, but anything you do say." But Margaret wasn't listening. Her whole body seemed to sag as though the weight of what she had done had finally become too much to bear. Miss Marple rose slowly, offering the woman a look of quiet sympathy. "You did it out of love." "I believe that." But love should never be an excuse for murder. Margaret's breath shuddered out of her. Then finally she nodded. I know. As Margaret Wade sat, shoulders hunched, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps, Chief Inspector Craddock signaled to his officers. They stepped forward, prepared to take her into custody. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth starkly contrasting the chill that had settled over the room. Miss Marple observed Margaret with a look not of triumph, but of quiet understanding. It is a terrible thing to bear the weight of another's secrets, Miss Marple murmured, her voice gentle, and an even worse thing to destroy oneself for them. Margaret's head lifted, her eyes hollow. You don't understand, she whispered. You think you know everything, but you don't. Craddock sighed. Mrs. Wade, I'd advise you not to say anything further until you have legal counsel. But Margaret let out a strange, breathy laugh. Legal counsel? Oh, Inspector, you've got it all wrong. I didn't kill Lionel. A hush fell over the room. Craddock stiffened. Miss Marple merely tilted her head, hands still folded in her lap. You confessed, Craddock said slowly. You admitted you poisoned him. Margaret's fingers dug into the arms of her chair. I said I had no choice, that I had to silence him, and I did, but I didn't use poison. I burned the last pages of his composition, the ones that would have given away the truth. Miss Marple inhaled softly. Then the poison? Margaret's head shook violently. It wasn't me. A silence followed, heavy with something unspoken. Miss Marple observed the woman closely, noting the shift in her demeanor, not the desperate defiance of a cornered murderer, but something else. Regret, grief, and the glimmer of something deeper. Then who? Craddock demanded. Margaret's lips parted, but before she could speak, a loud, shattering sound erupted from the window. A sharp crack, glass spraying across the floor, and then silence. Craddock reacted instantly, reaching for his revolver, barking orders to his men. One officer rushed to the window, peering out into the night, but the darkness beyond revealed nothing. Miss Marple, however, had not moved. She remained seated, her eyes narrowing slightly, her mind fitting the final piece into place. She turned back to Margaret. You knew, she said quietly. Margaret's shoulders trembled. I suspected, but I couldn't. She shook her head. I couldn't believe it. Craddock took a step closer, his face grim. Who, Margaret? Who poisoned Lionel Wade? Margaret's gaze flickered to Miss Marple, and in that moment, understanding passed between them. Miss Marple exhaled softly. It was Henry Redfern, wasn't it? Margaret let out a strangled sound. Half sob, half gasp. I should have known, she whispered. I should have known when Lionel wouldn't look at him, when he refused to speak about what he knew. Craddock swore under his breath. Redfern was with us when we confronted Mrs. Wade. He must have realized we were getting too close. Miss Marple nodded. He saw Margaret as the perfect scapegoat. He knew she had destroyed the composition, and he must have thought that would be proof enough of her guilt. Craddock turned sharply to his officers. Find him! Now! The men scattered, but Miss Marple remained still, her thoughts turning over every detail, every inconsistency. And then, as if struck by lightning, her lips parted. No, she whispered. Not Henry. Craddock froze. What do you mean, not Henry? Miss Marple straightened, her voice firm. It wasn't Henry Redfern. It was someone even closer to Lionel. Someone he never suspected. The fire flickered. Margaret's breath hitched. The real murderer, Miss Marple continued, was Lionel's protege. Stephen Caulfield. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. No, that can't be. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp now, all traces of grandmotherly softness replaced by unyielding certainty. Lionel was going to expose Redfern for Peter Radcliffe's murder, but what he never realized, what no one realized, Was that Stephen was the one who had truly orchestrated it all? Craddock's face darkened. Caulfield. But why? Miss Marple let out a soft sigh. Because Stephen Caulfield didn't just want to be a composer, he wanted to be the composer. He idolized Lionel, but he also resented him. He saw Redfern as weak, a liability, someone who could be manipulated. He pushed Redfern to kill Radcliffe, knowing full well that Lionel would uncover the truth. And when Lionel did, she turned back to Margaret, her voice gentle. That's when he had to die. Margaret sat frozen, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Lionel trusted him. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Yes, and that was his undoing. Craddock let out a slow breath. Then that means... But before he could finish, another sharp crack split the air. A second gunshot. From somewhere inside the house. Craddock bolted for the door, Miss Marple and Margaret close behind. Down the hall they found one of the officers slumped against the wall, a crimson stain spreading across his uniform. His hand weakly pointed toward the study. Craddock barely hesitated before kicking the door open. Inside, Stephen Caulfield stood, a gun in his trembling hand, his face twisted with fury. Across from him, Henry Redfern lay sprawled on the floor, unmoving, his chest rising in weak, ragged breaths. Caulfield's eyes flicked wildly to Craddock, then to Miss Marple. His fingers tightened around the gun. "You," he spat. Miss Marple took a single step forward. "It's over, Stephen." His chest heaved. "No, it's not. You have no proof." But Miss Marple merely gestured to the man at his feet. "You just gave it to us." Stephen's grip faltered. Just enough. Craddock lunged. The gun clattered to the floor. Officers swarmed the room, pinning Stephen down. He fought, but it was useless. Within moments, the handcuffs were snapped into place. Miss Marple let out a quiet breath. Margaret stood at the doorway, her face unreadable. "Why?" she asked softly. Stephen let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "Because he was a coward," he sneered, his gaze fixed on Redfern. "He would have let it all come undone, but I had real talent. I deserved the world to know my music. Not Lionel. Not him." Miss Marple shook her head. "But the world will only remember you for this, Mr. Caulfield. Not your music, not your genius. Only this." Stephen's breath stilled, and for the first time, true horror crept into his eyes. Craddock turned to his men. "Take him away." As Stephen was led from the room, Miss Marple turned to Margaret, her voice low, soft. "Lionel's music will still be heard, my dear. He'll live on in every note." Margaret closed her eyes. "I know," she whispered. And though her heart ached, for the first time in days, she could breathe. As the echo of Stephen Caulfield's struggles faded down the corridor, a thick silence settled over the study. Miss Marple stood motionless, her sharp eyes lingering on the unconscious figure of Henry Redfern sprawled across the floor. Craddock knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his pulse. "He's alive," the chief inspector confirmed, his voice flat but firm. "Barely." A doctor was summoned, and within minutes the room was filled with hushed urgency. The injured officer was tended to first, his wound deemed non-fatal. Henry Redfern, however, remained in critical condition, his fate uncertain. Margaret Wade hadn't moved. She stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself as though to hold together the fraying edges of her world. Miss Marple approached her gently, her voice soft yet unwavering. "You loved your husband very much." Margaret inhaled shakily, her eyes shining. "I did, and I hated him too sometimes. But I never wanted this. I never wanted—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple reached out, clasping Margaret's trembling fingers. "Love and hate are not so different, my dear. Both make us blind to what we do not wish to see." Margaret swallowed hard. her gaze flicking toward Redfern. "He tried to stop Stephen, didn't he?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, though I suspect he realized it too late. Stephen was always the greater danger, the true mastermind." Craddock exhaled through his nose, rising to his feet. A gifted composer, a ruthless schemer, and now a murderer. He'll face the full weight of the law. But Miss Marple's expression didn't mirror his certainty. She turned, staring at the open study window, the broken shards of glass glinting under the dim light. "Something still troubles you," Craddock observed. She was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Stephen Caulfield knew the game was up. He had nothing left to lose. And yet, her lips pressed into a thin line. And yet he didn't try to flee. Craddock frowned. He had nowhere to go. "Perhaps—" Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful, but there was an unease in her posture, a tension that had not quite eased. Or perhaps he had already won. A sudden shout from the hall sent a ripple of alarm through the room. One of the officers burst in, his face pale. "Sir, Caulfield, he's gone." Craddock's expression darkened. "What do you mean, gone?" "He was in the car, handcuffed. One of the officers turned for only a second, and he wasn't there," Margaret gasped. Craddock strode forward, his presence commanding. "Set up roadblocks, alert the railway stations, the ports. He won't get far." But Miss Marple did not share his urgency. Instead, she turned slowly, her gaze resting on the study, on the very room where Lionel Wade had died. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its embers barely flickering, and then, as if struck by an idea so chilling that it sent ice through her veins, she turned to the chief inspector. "He won't run, Inspector." "He doesn't need to." Craddock looked at her sharply. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple's hands clasped together, steady despite the quiet gravity in her voice. "He never planned to escape." Margaret inhaled sharply. "But if he's not running, then—" Miss Marple turned to her. "Then he's still here." Craddock cursed under his breath, barking orders to his men. The house was searched from top to bottom, every room, every hidden corner. But there was no sign of Stephen Caulfield, only the whisper of cold air from an open window. The minutes stretched into an hour. The search extended beyond the house into the surrounding grounds, the hedges, the tree line. Nothing. And then, a scream. A maid, young and trembling, stood at the far side of the estate's pond, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Stephen Caulfield lay face up in the water, his body unnaturally still. The police rushed forward, dragging him onto the bank. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, and clasped in one frozen hand was a single sheet of music, its ink smeared by the damp. A suicide note of sorts, a final composition. Craddock let out a slow, measured breath. "It's over." Miss Marple, standing a few paces away, was silent. Her gaze lingered on Stephen's lifeless face, on the strange peace that had settled upon it. And she wondered, not for the first time, if, in the end, Stephen had seen this as his only true finale. Margaret's voice was small. "Is this justice?" Miss Marple turned to her, her expression unreadable. "Justice is a strange thing, my dear. It comes in many forms." Craddock exhaled. "One way or another, the truth is out. The right man paid the price." Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward the house, toward the study where so many lives had unraveled. "Yes," she murmured, but not before taking his final bow. As dawn broke over the estate, a thin mist curled along the ground, veiling the events of the previous night in an eerie hush. The police had left, their work concluded, leaving only faint footprints in the damp grass and a lingering sense of unease. Stephen Caulfield was dead. Henry Redfern remained unconscious, his fate uncertain. The case was closed, and yet Miss Marple did not leave. She stood at the study window, staring out at the pond where Caulfield had met his end. The water was calm now, save for the occasional ripple of a passing bird. But Miss Marple's gaze was not on the surface. It was on the depths, on the shadowed places just beyond sight. Chief Inspector Craddock approached, his steps measured. "I thought you'd be on the first train home, Miss Marple. Case solved, justice served." She did not turn. "Yes, solved." Her voice was quiet. "And yet something remains. Unfinished." Craddock exhaled. "You think there's more to it?" Miss Marple finally turned to him, her blue eyes sharp despite their softness. "Tell me, Chief Inspector, did you examine the music sheet found in Stephen Caulfield's hand?" Craddock frowned. "His suicide note?" Of course, it was wet and smeared, but the message was clear enough. A lament, a confession of sorts. Miss Marple inclined her head. "A confession, or a composition?" Craddock's brows knit together. "What do you mean?" She stepped past him, moving toward the desk where Lionel Wade had once worked. Her fingers brushed against the surface, where faint scratches marred the wood, scratches that had been there before the murder. Miss Marple had noticed them days ago, but only now did they seem significant. Stephen Caulfield was a brilliant composer, was he not? She mused. A man who believed in the power of music to tell a story, to reveal emotions too complex for mere words. Craddock's patience thinned. "Miss Marple, what are you suggesting?" She turned back to him, her voice soft but firm. "I'm suggesting that his final act was not a confession. It was a message." Craddock hesitated. "A message to whom?" Miss Marple sighed, clasping her hands. "To those who could understand it." Margaret Wade, who had been lingering in the doorway, stepped forward. "You mean, it wasn't over?" Miss Marple studied her for a long moment before nodding. "The melody, Margaret. You were married to a musician. You must have recognized it, even if you did not realize it at the time." Margaret's lips parted, and then her breath caught. I did. But I thought it was just a variation of something he'd written before. A refrain from an old composition." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Exactly. But tell me, my dear, what was the title of that old composition?" Margaret's throat bobbed as she swallowed, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "The Last Deception." Craddock stiffened. "Deception?" Miss Marple nodded. "Stephen was many things. A genius, a manipulator, a murderer. But he was also proud. A man like that does not simply surrender to fate. He plays to the very last note." Margaret's hands curled into fists. "Then, what did he mean?" Miss Marple turned back to the window. "I suspect we have not yet found all the players in his grand finale." Craddock's mouth set in a grim line. "You think someone else was involved?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a scrap of paper on the desk, an old note written in Lionel Wade's hand. It was insignificant at first glance, just a scribbled reminder about an appointment long past. But then her fingers traced the edges, feeling the faint indentations left behind by words that had once rested on top of it. She picked up a pencil, lightly shading over the surface. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, hidden writing emerged. Impressions of words pressed too hard onto the paper above. And there, faint but undeniable, was a name that should not have been there, a name that had never once been considered. Miss Marple's lips pressed together as realization dawned. Stephen Caulfield had not been working alone. The mystery was not over. It had only just begun.